All right, evidence for evolution. Is this video going to be cringy? You bet, because I'm a high school teacher. All right, let's roll. So this is really day one of 4 days talking about the evidence for Darwin's view of evolution. So there's going to be day one is evidence for evolution, day two is evidence for design, and then there's 2 days of rebuttals. So this is the first day. As we go through today's lesson, and as you guys listen, I want you guys to think about which line of evidence supports microevolution, which one supports macroevolution. So review that Venn diagram of the differences and the similarities between these two. As a Star Wars nerd, I had to throw this in there, evolution of weapons. So the textbook, biology textbook, presents 7 or 8 different lines of evidence for evolution, and we'll kind of work our way through that, talking about each one. I first want to talk about bad reasons, one crappy reason to disagree with the theory of evolution. I think there are good reasons to disagree. I think there are bad reasons. And the first bad reason, I think, is that evolution is just a theory. A lot of people say to me that they don't want their student to learn evolution because it's just a theory. Why teach it if it's just a theory? And I think that misunderstands the use of the word theory, if that's what you're saying. Theory isn't just a mindless guess. Sometimes we say, oh, I have a weird theory about this, and we talk about it, but scientifically, we use the weird theory in a different way. So if you guys are interested, there's a video. You guys can type this into YouTube and watch this video. It says, what's the difference between scientific law and theory? I think it's a fantastic video talking about in science, we use theories to describe the why behind something, and we use laws or facts to describe the what's happening. So if I drop something, if I drop this controller, I can describe how fast that accelerates, and that would be the fact or the law, the mathematical law behind it. But the theory about why it drops, as soon as you answer the question why, you're now going to be proposing a theory. And I think it's an incredibly helpful way to think of the word theory. So evolution is a theory, and there are bad theories and there are good theories. If you guys see up here, there are Martian canals and alchemy and geocentric models and spontaneous generation and lots of different things we've had in science that have been overthrown. And so there are lots of bad theories, but there are also lots of good theories like gravity. Just because it's a theory doesn't mean I wouldn't teach it. So let's get back into this guy. Okay, so evidence number one for the theory of evolution is biogeography. There are 2 different steps of biogeography. There's one, the first one is called adaptive radiation, is what you guys see here with the tortoises and the finches that we've talked a lot about. The idea here is that a population starts the same. So this bird population migrated to the Galapagos Island. They started the same, and then over time they become more and more and more different over time. So as they've radiated outward to different islands, as they've moved out to different islands, they have developed adaptations. So adaptive radiation. Their shell types for tortoises have changed. Their beak types for finches have changed. And that is one evidence of the theory of evolution. So they start the same and end up different species. Even in 2 years after a drought happened in the Galapagos, after there was no water, all of these small beaked finches died and these large beaked finches lived, and so the average went up by like 0.4 millimeters, which is actually a huge change in 2 years. And so those changes can happen fast. Second line of evolution is similar to adaptive radiation. It has to do with geography, but we call this one convergent evolution. So if you guys see this picture on the bottom right, I think this is the best picture. You see this ancient prehistoric quadruped, 4-legged animal, and you see this what looks like a reptile kind of turtle. And we've shown in evolution, again, I'm wearing my evolution hat today, we've shown in evolution that this basic dinosaur has turned into an ichthyosaur, has evolved over millions of years into an ichthyosaur. This 4-legged animal is the ancestor of hippos, dolphins, whales, have this common ancestor called synonyx, and this is what they think now. This is synonyx. And over time, even though these populations started different and there were no fins, these different populations, when it's wet out, when they're near the ocean, they develop fins. So even though they start different, they converge onto the same adaptation. So convergent evolution is like merging your car and traffic. The different populations develop the same adaptation. Think of that as convergent evolution. Very different populations developing the same adaptation if the conditions require it. Okay, so that's evidence number one, biogeography. Adaptive radiation, so they start the same, they get different, and convergent evolution, they start different and get the same. Okay, evidence number 2, guys, is universal genetic code. Now I'll put some information up here. So this is how the argument goes. If every single living thing on the planet has DNA, has the same A, T, C, and G, the same 4 letters in their DNA, doesn't that infer that all of those species then have a common ancestor? If that common ancestor, if this founder, if the very first simple cell had that DNA with those same 4 letters, and every organism after it has the same DNA, isn't that an evidence that every single living thing can trace its ancestry back to that founder that had that DNA? So universal genetic code would argue that we have a common descendant. Every single living thing has commonly descended from a single cell. Similar to illustrate this founder effect, if you guys can imagine a colony started by 2 redheads and they have kids and all their kids have kids, and 100 years from now, that colony would expect to be mostly redheaded. If the founders have it, their descendants will have it. Just like in this Amish community in Pennsylvania, Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome results in multiple fingers and a heart condition. And a lot of them have Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome, even though we don't have it. Because if the founders of that Amish community had it, then their descendants will have it. Just like if the ancestor for all of us, a single cell with the same DNA, their descendants would each have that same DNA, and that's what we find. Okay, third line evidence. So we talked about biogeography, we talked about universal DNA. Third line evidence is talking about homologous structures, and we've talked about the prefix homo a lot. Hetero means different, homo means same. So these must mean the same structures. Thinking through with me, guys, in my arm I have 1 bone here, I have 2 bones in my forearm, I have lots of bones in my wrist, I have 8 bones in here, and I have palm bones and finger bones. I actually find the same thing true in frogs and alligators and chickens and horses and humans. If you trace that ancestry back far enough, what you find would be an ancient lobe fish that has the same 1 bone, 2 bone, lots of bones and fingers, just like you find in all of their descendants. Same thing for whales. Wouldn't there be a common ancestor that had that same kind of blueprint? 1 bone, 2 bones, lots of bones and fingers. So that's evidence number 3, and that's just one example. Evidence number 4, so we talked about biogeography, universal DNA, homologous structures, and evidence number 4 is embryology. Ology means the study of or knowledge, and this is of embryos. So really famous picture is this bottom picture you see done by Ernst Haeckel, one of Darwin's big promoters in the 19th century. If you observe different species in different stages of embryonic development in the womb, you'll find that the earlier in development they are, the more similar they are. So if this is a salamander, early, mid, late development, turtle, early, mid, late, duck, early, mid, late, pig, early, mid, late, human, early, mid, late, you'll find that early on they look almost exactly the same. And then as they develop, they get more and more different, almost pointing back to this evolutionary history of when we look the same, share the same structure, same development. So that's embryology. So biogeography, universal DNA, homologous structures, embryology, 4 lines of evidence for evolution. The fossil record is one of the largest fields of evidence for evolution. A lot of people think of this first when they think of the evidence. So you guys can imagine going back 10,000 years in the past, 15,000 years in the past, you might find tree stumps that give evidence for age. You go back 30 to 50,000 years in the past, we use carbon dating. You go 100 to 100,000 years, 300,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 65 million years is this KT extinction right here. If you guys see my arrow, this KT extinction is when the dinosaurs went extinct, big meteor hit the Earth. You go 500 million years back, and you find this Cambrian period, and that is one of the very first periods of time where we find a lot of organisms show up in the fossil record. Current estimations of the Earth's age is about 4.5 billion years old, with the first life popping up about 3 billion years ago. So those are current estimations held by a lot of scientists. Really famous fossil right here. If you guys see this picture of this weird creature with bones, and actually you can kind of see these wings, these feathers coming off of the bones. This was a dinosaur, a feathered dinosaur, so kind of a precursor of birds. This name is Archaeopteryx, the name of this fossil. This fossil over here is Lucy. Students oftentimes tell me, oh, we came from apes. Is this true? And the theory of evolution wouldn't say that we came from apes, but that apes and men have a common ancestor in the distant past, many 100,000 years ago. And so what did that organism or population look like? And Lucy is a collection of bones that would simulate what our ancestor might have looked like. So that's Lucy, another famous. So Archaeopteryx and Lucy, two famous fossils pointing to macroevolution. Another really interesting, even more interesting, I would argue, line of evidence for evolution is this whale evolution of cetaceans. And let me see if I can show you guys a couple of videos with this. So if you guys want to see a video on adaptive radiation where things start the same and get different, there's this really great video here about Galapagos finches, 16 minutes long. I'd encourage you to watch that. We watched that in class. What is the evidence for evolution? This is a one-stop shop for a lot of different these lines of evolution. If you type this in, this stated clearly, Gaia is pretty balanced. And then this one, most interesting, whale evolution. It's a 7-minute long video. If you type this in, this follows Gingrich, a paleontologist who looks at the evolution of cetaceans or whales. Very, very interesting. So I encourage you guys to go watch that. If you can find the fossils for cetaceans, if you find their evolution, if you go back, they have hip bones in Basilosaurus, hip bones, toe bones, a knee bone, kneecap bone. And if you can connect these dots from this basic four-legged land-dwelling mammal, Synonyx, you can trace that forward all the way to whales and dolphins. You can prove that macroevolution has really occurred. So that's the fossil record. Lots of similarities between whale stomachs and hippo stomachs. I actually think a lot of scientists think that whales and hippos are cousins with a common ancestor of Synonyx, that four-legged mammal. Okay, we talked about biogeography. We've talked about universal DNA, homologous structures, embryology, the fossil record, and this is the sixth line of evidence, vestigial structures. Vestigial just means useless. You might think of bringing 4 people to a 3-on-3 basketball tournament. One of them is going to be vestigial. One of them might have had a function in the past, but they're now the useless one. So vestigial structures might be anything from whales' hip bones. Why do whales have hip bones? I want that to sink in. That's an astounding fact. Whales used to have hip bones. Why is that true? From a cormorant, a bird that doesn't use its wings, to a 3-toed skink that doesn't use these little arms, totally useless, to a human, again, this is the strong argument, to a human, this appendix right here, hanging off your small intestine, you're in the lower right part of your abdomen. Why would humans have an appendix that does nothing but burst and kill you? This useless structure, why would that be there unless there's an evolutionary past to it when it used to have a function? So again, whales, their distant ancestor used to have legs and hips, and now it's useless. So this is evidence of an evolutionary history. Okay, last line of evidence, guys, is mutations, is genetics. So if you look at the DNA between different animals, can you compare the similarities in their DNA and the differences, the mutations in their DNA, and show their ancestry? So if you look at this bottom right graph, I think this is the one I want to hang on. You collect all the DNA, if you guys see this over here, new mutation, new mutation, new mutation. These 3 species, and you try and say which ones are more closely related to each other. I would go backwards and look at this other common ancestor and say, wow, that all the DNA is the same here. And as that population moved to 2 different areas, and over time they developed different mutations in green and in yellow. And over time, this population moved to 2 different areas, and these new mutations in yellow and in purple. You find that of these 3 modern-day species, that the top 2 are likely more closely related because they share the A mutation, even though they don't share the T and the C. And the bottom one is more distantly related, farther back, farther away. They separated earlier because they don't share that A mutation and they have other mutations. So this is one way that geneticists go back and say, what is the evolutionary tree for different species? They do the same thing for ground finches versus these woodpecker finches right here to say, all right, all the ground finches are more closely related because their DNA is more similar. The woodpecker finches separated out earlier, very early on from the Galapagos. So you can use genes to show that. Another interesting area of genetics to show evolution would be how do you explain new body plans that come up with new species that arrive on the fossil record? How is that possible? And one possibility would be to explain it with this thing called Hox genes. Hox genes are a set of genes in your DNA and pig's DNA and fly DNA, everything, that control where things show up. So if you see this fly picture, there's legs coming out of his head. because this is a simple mutation in a Hox gene that shows that the legs should pop out of the head instead of and lower in the abdomen. So it can be a simple gene mutation that can cause new traits to move places, new traits to duplicate. So you might have a dragonfly with 2 pairs of wings, 3 pairs of wings, 4 pairs of wings via Hox mutations. So this is a really interesting field of genetic research that is still being uncovered, still being discovered. So those are the 7 lines of evidence. If you go back and review that, that would be going all the way from biogeography, adaptive radiation, convergent evolution, universal RNA, DNA, homologous structures, same structures, embryology, the fossil record, vestigial useless structures, and mutations. And there's 7 lines of evidence for the theory of evolution. Thanks, guys.